We're now joined by the Daily Mirror's Midlands correspondent, James Nursey. James, it's been an interesting time in the Midlands. How surprised were you to hear that Martin O'Neill had resigned? We've spoken to people this week who said that they spoke to him just before the weekend, and he was very unhappy. This has been brewing for a long time, hasn't it?
It has, Steve. I think the only element of surprise is that it's come 5 days before the start of the Premier League season, which is most inconvenient for the club. But as you say, there have been rumours that O'Neill was going to leave Villa Park since as far back as March, as we've documented in the Daily Mirror. And really, he's been on a collision course with the owner for some time because Villa's wage bill has reached £70 million a year, which is just unsustainable for a club like Villa. Cuts had to be made. O'Neill wanted to push on to have a better crack at Champions League football, but the chairman felt he'd already put enough in a bid to crack the top four. And really, a breakdown like this has been inevitable for some time.
It is quite an extraordinary time to leave the club, isn't it? I mean, are we convinced that there was no great sort of apocalypse here, that it was just a matter of, him being told to follow a script and he didn't want to follow it, or do we think that somebody came to him and said that Ashley Young might have to be sold, or that the money you get for James Milner wouldn't be able to be spent?
People who deal with O'Neill regularly know that he's not the sort of man just to make a snap decision. He's known as one of the deepest thinkers in the game. The players are always joking that at the training ground he sort of walks around with his glasses up holding the bridge of his nose and he's deep in thought. This isn't a man just to make a snap decision. This is something he's been thinking about for several months. And this is ultimately the conclusion he's made, is that he felt he had no other choice but to leave the club.
And I guess the fact that John Robertson and Steve Walford and Seamus McDonough have gone with him seems to indicate that it was a kind of it wasn't a spur of the moment decision, was it?
No, I mean, he would have thought about all these sort of things before handing in his resignation, because those guys are very much part of the O'Neill package. He knows that by leaving the club he would also be ending their livelihoods as well, and I'm sure that's something he's thought deeply about. Again, that's another reason why he wouldn't just make a snap decision just to wake up one day and have a row and decide to go.
Now, one of the most interesting things to come out of this the fallout of all of this is your story of Wednesday, I believe, which said that Villa players had been sending pictures of bottles of champagne via message to each other's mobile phones.
Yeah.
Was he universally unpopular? He'd certainly fallen out with some fairly key figures recently, hadn't he?
Well, I think it would be wrong for me to say that 100% of the changing room wanted to see him go, but certainly the percentage was creeping up all the time. Initially, you probably had a handful of guys who weren't on the team, such as Rio Cook and Curtis Davis, with an axe to grind against the manager. But his behaviour towards the end of his reign had become so extreme that I think by the end there was a lot of relief in the dressing room. Curtis Davis, of course, has admitted that when he was stopped on Tuesday, the day after O'Neill went, he stopped to speak to the press outside the gates of the training ground, and he said a lot of the lads feel they weren't given a fair crack of the whip. I mean, he just wants the new manager to be fair, he said. I mean, that was an interesting insight into the dynamics in the dressing room, and I have absolutely no doubt that there was this flurry of text messages being fired around when O'Neill left.
Mm. And he'd recently fallen out with a very senior member of the defence, hadn't he? Over what was that over?
Well, I just included an anecdote in my report the day after he left of a lot of the players were at the training ground and they weren't too happy with all the running they were being ordered to do. The hammer looked very sharp in pre-season matches. Results had not been good. And Richard Dunn suggested to O'Neill that maybe they should do a bit of ball work because they weren't looking quite so good with their first touch, etc., when they played these teams in pre-season training. And I'm told that the manager was so unimpressed with that. He said anyone who doesn't want to do the running can go. The rest of you get your trainers. And as you can imagine, that wasn't a very important.
I thought that was a really great piece that you wrote for the Mirror Football website yesterday, Thursday, your column this week, in which you sort of compare the way he deals with players and the way that Brian Clough dealt with players, who of course was O'Neill's boss at Nottingham Forest, and the two of them didn't really get on. Do you think that he's a victim of? Can you really treat players like that nowadays?
Well, that's pretty much what I was suggesting. No, I don't think you can. But today, the way Klopp managed in the 70s and the 80s is very different to the way managers operate today. I mean, I think there has to be a lot more contact with the players, their agents. These guys have got huge egos. They're superstars. They don't want to be. They don't want to be sort of managed as much as they are. I mean, the Villa players had to get sort of special permission from Martin O'Neill to do interviews and things. That's rather extreme. A lot of them are matured senior individuals who felt that they were being treated as kids. I mean, before the Carling Cup final, for example, they had to stay for 3 nights at the Grove before the game. I mean, this is very draconian behaviour. It's almost like saying, I don't trust you guys to eat and sleep properly at home, so I'm taking you all away. I can keep a close eye on you. I mean, guys, these days, Premier League footballers don't respond very well to that sort of manager. As we saw at the World Cup.
It's quite amazing, isn't it? It is quite amazing because, to be fair, I've stayed at the Grove, and if you asked me to go to the Grove for 3 nights, I'd be quite pleased about it.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, it is rather nice, isn't it?
But I suppose these guys, what they would say is, well, we're away a lot anyway. A lot of them international players, even before the Villa home games, they're staying at hotels in the city. And most of them have got a couple of young children. It's not where they want to be.
See, when you talk to those old Forest guys, the likes of Birtles and Francis, and even talking to O'Neill about it, they always go on about how Forest used to go on these. They used to go to Calamilor, didn't they, in Spain, on these kind of mid-season and pre-season trips. And it was a great jolly, and now they're kind of, professional footballers are kicking off about having to stay in a luxury hotel for 3 days in the depths of.
It is laughable, but at the same time, when you put yourself in their position, I do have some.
Yeah. Now, I mean, it's no secret, and you've written about this, that you didn't have a very easy relationship with O'Neill.
That is correct.
That is correct. How did that manifest itself?
Well, working in the Midlands, it is a fairly small patch, and Martin O'Neill has got to know all the journalists here, with the sort of exception of myself, over a number of years. So, as a newcomer, I think he was always a bit wary of me, and the Mirror being the paper that it is, we're always after sort of very explosive stories, and just essentially put me on a bit of a collision course with Mr. O'Neill. I mean, you may remember the famous incident with the fielding the weekend team in Moscow. I think we were the only paper really to go into detail about how happy the fans were about that. He then gave a meal for the supporters who travelled to Moscow to see the weekend team, and someone recorded it for me, and we put the extract on did a big article about it. I was the only member of the press to get it. Things like that sort of certainly rubbed Mr. O'Neill up the wrong way, that's for sure.
Is it? I mean, was he particularly difficult to deal with in terms of the other football managers you've worked with?
Well, you'd have to ask a few of the other journalists that, to be quite honest. But he put it like this. There was a difference in O'Neill, I believe, before and after his Celtic reign. I mean, he was a lot more open with the press before he went to Celtic. Up there, it's well documented. Whatever you say in Glasgow is basically back page news for the papers up there, because then he report about Celtic and Rangers on the back page. And I think he was a lot more wary at everything when he came back down to the Midlands. And was certainly very touchy and sensitive to any criticism.
Now, I'm not asking you to criticise him now, clearly, although clearly you can do if you want. I can't help thinking that he's had a bit of an easy ride over this. I'm just wondering what would happen if an American, a foreign manager had walked out of a Premiership club owned by English people 5 days before the start of the season. I expect that fella would have been crucified.
Mm.
You know, if Rafa Benitez had walked out 5 days before the start, maybe that's a bad example because of all the Liverpool stuff. But do you know what I mean? I think
I think you've got a very good point there. Certainly, some of the fans are hot under the collar about it, but O'Neill's been quite canny with, whilst the timing may appear clumsy and negative, from his perspective. He is on the brink of when James Milner's been sold to Man City, possibly Ashley Young to Tottenham. I mean, he, on the face of it, does have some legitimate reasons for going. So he's probably, we talked about it earlier, he's been pondering about, thinking for some time about leaving Villa, and I think, whilst it's unfortunate that it's 5 days before the start of the season, he felt he had all the reasons to do it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shocking thing, isn't it, that it's come so close to the start of the season. As you say, it looks to have torpedoed this Milner deal and Stephen Ireland going the other way, and whatever kind of opportunities may have arisen in the transfer market over the next couple of weeks, certainly, until somebody comes in. What's the kind of the feeling around there now? Are the players in a state of shock almost? I mean, Curtis Davies, although he was very direct, did seem a bit, they seemed a bit dazed, the guys who fronted up for the cameras.
Right, the fact it's so near the start of the season has surprised everyone, Steve. There's no doubt about that. Particularly the Villa hierarchy, because while there have been problems behind the scenes for some time, which was documented, they thought they'd cleared the air at the end of the season. Lerner held talks with Martin O'Neill in May. They agreed to operate and proceed under the new regime with cutbacks, knowing that there would be cutbacks in the reduced wage bill. So for them, quit 2 months later is a bit galling for the club, to say the least. And it's put them in a very difficult position, and that's why I think they'll probably give the caretaker Kevin McDonald 2 or 3 games, see how he does, because he has got quite a good record with the reserve team. And while he's not a big sexy name, he is well respected with the club, behind the scenes, and is popular with the players, which of course is a little different to his predecessor. Yeah,
and that's going to be important right now. I mean, put yourself in two people's situations. Do you think Liverpool are kicking themselves right now? Because if this had happened, 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago, they could have had Martin O'Neill, who is a sexy name, as you say, rather than Roy Hodgson, who is a great manager but isn't a sexy name, or to be fair, a sexy man. And also, do you think Mark Hughes is kicking himself as well?
Yeah, well, there's an interesting thing that you mentioned, Steve.
No offence to Roy Hodgson, by the way. It's just not my type.
I think if Liverpool wanted Martin O'Neill to replace Rafa Benitez, they could have had him. He's clearly up for the job, if you ask me. I mean, there's one of his interviews towards the end of May, after the rumour went round about him potentially quitting. It just sounded like a job advert to me, because he was just talking about how his reign and how he'd transformed the club. As regards to the Mark Hughes, his name being with Villa, that is a very interesting point. I mean, I think he was definitely the Villa hierarchy's preferred choice to replace O'Neill when the first suggestions arose that he was going to leave towards the end of last season. And I think Hughes was waiting for the Villa Park job. I mean, when Martin O'Neill gave a speech at the club's end of season dinner, he even mentioned Mark Hughes by name. This was a speech which was recorded in the Mirror that most people took as a leading speech, which, as it happened, that's exactly what it turned out to be. Now, Mark Hughes has gone to Fulham, and maybe 10 days later O'Neill's resigned. A lot of people at the club, the conspiracy theory doing the rounds, is that O'Neill deliberately waited until Mark Hughes had taken another job before leaving Villa Park, so as to mess up to 1 or 2 plans. That is just a conspiracy theory. I don't buy into that myself, but there you go. It's raised a few ironic smiles.
Well, I love a conspiracy theory, so obviously I believe that implicitly. And finally, I mean, is there a cash crisis, as we would say on the back page of the Daily Mirror at Aston Villa, or are they just trying to be prudent? And what has caused this? When Randy Lerner came in, they were the third big. They were the biggest spenders in Europe, weren't they? Was that 3 seasons ago when O'Neill bought all of those players who he turned out not to like very much, like Curtis Davies?
Yeah, well, there are some interesting points there. I know when Randy Lerner was convincing Gareth Barry to stay that summer where he didn't end up going to Liverpool a couple of years back.
Yeah.
Lerner was telling Barry, and spending all this money on players, we are going to get into the Champions League. Lerner was convinced that the money he was pumping in, which is over 100 million on players in the last few years, And O'Neill has said, well, I've done my best. If you want to get to the top four, I need another load of money. And Lerner, being a businessman, I think has looked at it and thought, well, if I keep giving you a blank check, there's no guarantee I'm going to get to the top four. And, this could bankrupt the club and possibly himself in the process. And Villa's wage bill is now £70 million, which is not really sustainable for a club of their size. So Lerner, being a businessman, I think has had to make some tough financial decisions, some pragmatic decisions. And these just haven't sat very well with Martin O'Neill.
Sure, and I think it's worth, I don't think there is any kind of great cash crisis, isn't there? But I think it's worth...
That's misleading. I mean, when we talk about cash crisis, really, we should be talking about clubs like Portsmouth, where they're struggling to pay their wages on a weekly, monthly basis. There's a transfer embargo. That's obviously not the case with Aston Villa. I think if they wanted to go out and buy Aidan McGeady or Robbie Keane today, they probably could, but I can understand why Lerner was reluctant to keep signing the checks for O'Neill when a number of his signings, you mentioned a couple of them earlier, Nicky Shorey, Steve Sidwell, Curtis Davis, Harvey Bay, Luke Young, weren't getting in the team and were earning sort of £40,000 a week. I mean, something had to give. And in the end, when O'Neill was so inflexible about the situation, he's walked.
Yeah, and I think it is fair to note that perhaps it's not quite as it appeared in the brochure when O'Neill joined, because Lerner is clearly operating in some reduced circumstances. Like everybody, like every businessman, he's obviously been hit by the crunch in some ways. I saw General Krulak was trying to pour cold water on the idea that this was in some way related to Randy Lerner getting divorced, but I don't think anyone gets richer when they get divorced.
Correct.
Especially not to when you get divorced from an heiress, as he's done. Yeah. And also, he's spending an awful lot more money on his American football team, the Cleveland Browns. He's had to bring in a very successful head coach as a kind of a director of football because the players don't like the existing head coach, and he's going to be costing a lot of money. Plus, they keep finishing. So they keep struggling so much that they always get one of the top players in the college draft. But the way that works, right, is that those players cost a lot of money. So if you pick first, it's great. You get the best player in the college draft, but you have to pay him $16-17 million a year. I think there maybe O'Neill has said, well, it's not like it appeared to be, and also has some of the personal responsibility that he once had has been taken away from him. Is that right?
Martin O'Neill.
Yes.
He used to have sole control of transfer dealings. He would negotiate with agents to determine players' contracts, etc., which is why you had a number of players earning probably more than they should be, like Aston. Well, there are a number of players earning more than £40,000 a week, and for some of them not to get a first-team game at Villa Park, you wonder why they're picking up those sort of paychecks. I think that things like that made prompted Lerner to put his right-hand man, trusted confidant, promoted him this summer to chief executive with a specific brief to get more involved in the club's transfer dealings, which went down like a lead balloon with O'Neill. I mean, I spoke to contacts who had meetings with the pair over transfers and with their existing players at Villa Park, and there was a noticeable tension and frostiness between the pair apparently. So things like that were definitely a large factor in O'Neill's demise and decision to go.
Well, it's a fascinating story, James. Thank you very much for sharing it with us, and we'll come back to you when they finally do get a manager. Sven, do you think?
No, to be honest, I don't think it will be Sven. Sven wants the job.
Sven wants any job, though, to be fair. He's applied for a couple here.
Would you want him managing your team? I wouldn't. So I don't think Randy Lerner does it, to be quite honest. I think in the short term, Kevin McDonald, as we reported in I think it was in yesterday's paper, will be given 2 or 3 games to stake his claim and pitch for the job. You might see someone like Steve Staunton coming in on a short-term basis to help him, one of his old pals. And if he wins his next 2 or 3 games, then there's every chance he could actually get the job. Beyond that, I think it is fair to assume that Jurgen Klinsmann and Fred Bradley, with their American connections, have a very, very good